This is TWiT.
Yesterday was I didn't note this, but I will note it now. I didn't note it yesterday, have a party or anything, but it's the 25th anniversary of OS 10.
Yeah,
Yep.
I mean, or at least it's the 2000 Macworld Expo where Steve Jobs unveiled the Aqua interface and showed off what we really think of. I mean, I watched the whole video. I wrote a piece about it at Macworld. Actually, technically, I wrote a piece about it at Macworld in the year 2000, and that's up
it's
there.
so good.
You can read
But
that.
now you
5
know
years
more.
later.
And I found the files on in an archive on my server, and I still have the Word files that I wrote. It turns out I wrote that whole story that day. Went back to the office. I've still got the timestamps on it from that day, January 2000. And anyway, I wrote a news story on Macworld about it on Sunday, and it's quite a trip to watch that event because, I mean, there are so many anniversaries of OS 10 because there's when 10.0 shipped and when the public beta shipped and when they brought Steve on stage in 1997 and when they brought him back in 1998 and he was there talking about the transition. But for me, this is the big one because so much of what he's demoing, first off, people are reacting to it like they've never seen anything like it. And yet from the perspective of 25 years later, it all seems totally normal. And that's the thing is, at the time, it did kind of blow you away as a Mac user because it was a completely new interface. But all that stuff, keep in mind the Mac was only 16 years old at that point. And Steve Jobs even undersold it and said, this will be the foundation of what we do for the next decade. And it's a quarter of a century later, still so much of what he showed is just what the Mac is now.
Yeah.
It really was a remarkable moment. So if you need to celebrate a single kind of birthday for OS 10, I think this is it. I think this is the one.
Yeah, and 100% the significance of OS 10. Remember that OS 10 was from the very, very get-go designed to be the foundation of everything Apple does in the future. So when it became time to do a phone interface, there's OS 10, and now we've turned that into iPhone OS. When an iPad became a version of OS 10 that was an iPad OS, everything is now built on OS 10. And from the very, very get-go, it was designed to be CPU non-specific, so that if at any point they wanted to make a change to what CPU they were using, they wouldn't have to undo everything in order to do it. And also make sure that we all remember, if those of us who were there for the 90s, man, Mac OS was in a really sad state. People were switching, lifelong Mac lovers were switching to Windows because it was simply more stable. It would, if something, it had the ability to let a piece of code crash without taking the entire platform down with it. And so many, even not only that, but the creature comforts of life, prettiness, things like that. It was so stagnant that we felt as though, thank goodness, we don't have to leave the Mac. Apple realizes they have a problem here. They're not going to try to just keep polishing the same incandescent light bulb. We're going into the LED.
And the problem, we were polishing 80 light bulbs. I mean, I remember trying to buy my parents a computer, and I got an Apple IIe when I was 12 and have Apple computers all the way up into it. And it's 1996 or 1997. And I'm trying to buy my parents a computer, and I couldn't figure out which one to buy because there were so many, and they were all so close together. Do I need the TV option, or do I need the CD? There was so many versions of it. And I just was so frustrated that I ended up not getting them one. I got something else for them or something. I was just it was a disaster. I mean, it just, and it was, and I think most companies have fall into this thing where they try to compete with Microsoft head to head. We're going to do everything that Microsoft does, and Microsoft's a different beast. It's got its own ecosystem, and learning, trying to do what Microsoft does is usually a recipe for disaster. And Apple was one of the first ones to really go down that path.
It all turned around when they brought Steve Jobs back, and along with Steve Jobs, they brought the next operating system.
That's the thing, is Jobs came back because they needed an operating system.
Right.
And they had tried multiple times to do that in those 16 years. They had tried Taligent and Pink. They had tried Copeland.
Symphony.
What ended up shipping as OS 8 was really just a cleanup of System 7 and the classic Mac OS.
And then you had BOS building.
Yeah, they were the BOS. They wanted to sell BOS to Apple, and Apple didn't want to buy it. Guess they tried that. And the thing is, Classic Mac OS, as much as it was loved, I mean, it was a product of that late 70s, early 80s, early days of personal computers, and it was not a modern operating system in any sense of the word. And so they were desperate to do something. Next Step ended up being the answer, and then Steve came along with a ride. Pretty good throw-in, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And Andy's absolutely right. By the way, in that era, I was working at Mac User magazine in the those mid to late 90s, and I remember I have these visceral memories of force rebooting my Mac multiple times a day because it would crash to a dead stop, and that was because there was no protected memory. The multitasking wasn't really real, and that's part of what's in this Jobs presentation. It's like there's a moment where he's playing a video and he drops a menu bar down, and the video keeps playing, and people lose their minds, and you're like, as a modern person, you're like, why? But like back then, if you drop that menu bar, the whole Mac stopped to drop a menu item because it couldn't multitask.
I was doing the radio show at the time, and I was very critical of Apple because System 7 and OS 9, which is the current operating system at this time, had terrible memory management. Yeah, and that's what you're talking about. Because it didn't have modern memory management. It couldn't do anything a modern computer could do.
One bad app took down the whole system. In fact, Jobs demos it. He has an app called The Bomb that he runs in this 2000 demo, and he says this does everything. It writes to memory everywhere it can. And he's playing a video. It's actually the Mission Impossible 2 trailer because Tom Cruise is immortal. And he runs the Bomb app, and the video just keeps playing in the background. And again, people lose their minds. But like as a Mac user, like something like that just takes down the system, and you got to reboot. And they couldn't do it. And so the other thing about this that's really interesting is he's trying to sell, I mean, Jobs, what a salesman, right? He's trying to sell OS 10 to Mac users here. And the thing about it is it's important that he does this because to Andy's point, especially, Windows in this era, the era of the wind in the sails from Windows 95, like already everybody, especially like the design pros, everybody's like, go to Windows NT, go to Windows, drop the Mac. Steve Jobs can't just sell this thing as, hey, we built you a brand new operating system for you to switch to. Because if they do that, everybody who's got a brain in their head is going to look at it and say, well, if I'm going to have to adapt to a brand new operating system that is nothing like what I've used before, I'll just go to Windows. The only thing holding people on the Mac was familiarity with the Mac. So all these Next Step engineers come in, and there is huge friction between the Next people and the Apple people. But they've got the Next has the code base. If they implement Next features, they don't have to rewrite the code. But then it doesn't look like the Mac because Next Step is very weird and not very Mac-like. But if they don't make it Mac-like enough to satisfy Mac users, they'll just switch to Windows. So it was really an existential moment for Apple to get OS 10 right. And keep in mind, they bought Next in 97. This is 2000 where they announced what they were going to do in terms of the interface. And they said they'd ship it that summer. They didn't ship it that summer. They shipped a public beta. They shipped it the next summer. So we're talking like a 4+ year period just to get to 10.0 shipping. Yeah. It took them a long time, but what is brilliant about it is what they shipped. It took a while. 0.0 wasn't very good. 0.1 was a lot better. They had to optimize for speed. 0.0 was really slow. But they did indeed build the foundation for Apple's future, not just for a decade, not just for the Mac, but for all these other interfaces and for a quarter century and counting. It's really quite remarkable. It's a very hard problem to solve, and they did end up getting there.
And not only did they solve it, they sold it. And I think we just have to keep on coming back to how good Steve Jobs was at selling things.
Was this his best example of? It was an early example, but one of his better examples of Steve Jobs, the pitchman, the seller.
I think so. I mean, I think that his pinnacle was definitely.
This is the one where he said
the
one
iPhone
of the design goals.
This is real.
You quote this in Macworld's your Macworld piece. One of the design goals, Steve said, was when you saw it, you wanted to lick it.
Yep.
Very famous, right?
And then how long did we deal with all that Aqua? How many buttons did we have to create? I had finally created a set of actions in Photoshop that would create the Aqua button. So you could just select it and hit a button and hit go and it would just go and turn it into an Aqua button because that's how you look modern. And then there was some point that it all was not modern anymore.
Remember for a hot minute there, they said, "Hey, we thought that the Apple menu would look good in the middle of this menu bar instead of to the side."
Non-functional logo. And then, that was one of those public beta things where people are like, no, you need an Apple menu, and they retasked the Apple menu.
It really wasn't until 10.4 until it was a finished, like, usable operating system. It was like they made lots of progress, and I think but there was a while before. Okay, will it print? Yes. Will I file compatibility? Yes. Will all the multitasking work? Yes. All this sort of stuff that we were waiting to actually. And the thing is, Steve Jobs created a picture of an Apple that finally had its stuff together, and that if they said that we have a plan and we have a plan to execute that plan, you might even start to believe them. I mean, this was before OS 10. This was when they were trying to develop Rhapsody, when they're trying to develop like Symphony, Copeland, all this other stuff. This was the time where I was still getting emails that were intended for worldwide Apple executives at the VP level. And so I was hearing about lots of backbiting, about lots of stuff of wasted effort. Oh, well, the print system kind of works, but we decided to toss everything and put this under a new manager for organizational reasons. And that, as much as anything else, I mean, you could write an entire book just about all the things that Apple needed to do and successfully did to convince each other that they had their act together finally, and to actually become the seeds of the company that they would once become.
Well, and I think part of
James Thompson talks about watching this because, of course, he's very well known as the author of PCalc and Drag Thing. But before there was Drag Thing, he wrote the doc for this, and he talks about his experience of watching. And this is the original doc, which was hideous with Square. He talks about watching Steve, hoping it didn't crash from his home in Ireland. It's a really good piece, by the way. If you haven't read it from his three letter acronym blog.
He's given a bunch of presentations about this, but he's never put it down in words. And I was writing my story for Macworld, and I sent him an iMessage, and I basically said, is there a preferred link where you tell this story? And he's like, I don't think there is. I think there's just various presentations I've given over time.
So he wrote this up because of you?
And so he wrote that story so I could have something to link to. And it's great. and it's got that classic moment, because the thing is, Steve really wanted everybody in Cupertino. So the classic moment is somebody offhandedly mentions that they'll get their developer who's working on the dock in from Ireland, and Steve goes like, okay, and then goes to another room and finds the manager in charge of James, and basically says,
it has come to my attention that the engineer working on the dock is in effing Ireland.
Yeah, and so he was given an ultimatum that he had to move to Cupertino or he had to quit, and instead he refused to move to Cupertino. So what they did is they gave him an office, and they had him fly in, and they've hid him for quite a while. And then finally he was found out, and he just said, I'm not going to move to California. So that was it. And he went back to doing Drag Thing, and they threw out his doc. They actually rewrote, the next person on the project rewrote that doc again. Also, that doc demo is weird. There are things in that demo that are very strange. They're like the single window mode that you clicked on another button that was on the right side of the title bar. They got rid of that. The Apple menu in the center was very weird. And the dock, at that point, there's actually a dock folder in your user folder. So you could drag a file from the desktop, and Steve does in the demo, onto the dock, and the file disappears from the desktop. And as a modern Mac user, you're like, what? Wait, what? Where'd it go? And then he takes the file off the dock and drags it back to the desktop, and it goes out of the dock onto the desktop. You're like, what? Wait, huh? How? Because they changed that completely later on, that metaphor, because it used to be you could literally just save a file into the dock folder, and it would just show up on the dock. Yeah.
By the way, that's how Microsoft did it. And so that's naturally the way that they would attempt it.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to configure then, but much easier just to drag it to the dock. Pretty incredible.
Yeah. So it's a long thing, but even if you just watch the part where Steve intros it,
let me show you. This is where people go crazy.
So much of it is, the genie effect, which was definitely a Steve
Tom Cruise
thing.
Jumps out of the dock
but it doesn't play in the dock, and Steve actually says we're going to make it so you can actually see the video playing in the dock, but it doesn't actually do it during the demo, and they did get there with that. And there are a bunch of things that clearly are just for Steve, right? Like the Finder, he talks about the Finder, and the Finder is very different. It's more like a browser than it was in the original, where there was sort of
that was the next step Finder.
Exactly.
That's our next step.
I love that browser.
But they added, so what they added was they added they had icon support and list support, which were the things that Mac users were used to. And then Steve, you can hear it in his voice. He's
Steve's
like,
grin.
and then you've got this really cool column view. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the next view. That's Steve's favorite view.
Yeah.
And he's really into that. Just like he introduces Mail, Apple Mail, also 25 years ago that it was introduced. And that was because Steve's favorite email program was on Next Step. And when he went back to Apple and he was using the Mac, he was really mad because he didn't like the email programs on the Mac, and he got them to start moving Next Step Mail over. And so he's, it's Steve Jobs. If you hate Apple Mail or love it, either way, blame Steve Jobs, because that was Next Mail, and that's what he wanted, and so he got it. And you can see he demos that too, and you can see his delight in it because he loved that app. So there's certain things that Steve clearly made happen because he liked them so much.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he does this genie effect.
The genie effect, so many. They wired
many
in the
times.
slow motion of it so that he could hold down a couple of keyboard commands
right.
and do the slow mo.
That's right.
And he just kept doing it. Oh my god! I mean, it is showing off that they're using a much more advanced graphics imaging system that's based on PDF, just like how Next was on Display PostScript.
Look how happy he is, though. It's so cute.
It is. I mean, it's literally, it is kind of a masterclass too, because it's just a dude at a keyboard and a mouse. Like, there's not a lot to it. He's just a guy using his computer on stage, and he does a pretty good job.
It was doing things that other computers couldn't do, and it wasn't like, and suddenly it was like, well, it doesn't do that. And I think that one thing that Apple's good at, and I think Steve was exceptionally good at, is picking out things that they're not functional, but they give you like a little, like, oh, that's cool, like that surprise and delight, and that surprise and delight.
That's pretty important.
Just doing something. Well, I think it's actually one of the most important things, because what happens is people make
that's what sticks with you. Yeah.
Well, what people make decisions subconsciously about products, and that's the most dangerous place for them to make those decisions. If they make a decision, because when they do it consciously, you can argue with them and persuade them to go some other direction. But when they subconsciously decide it's cooler or that it's a little sleeker or whatever, when you talk to big companies, they talk about this all. The design teams, like, they're thinking about things like about that kind of thing all the time, of how, if something looks just a little bit more refined or just a little bit cooler, not crazy, but just a little bit more, people like, and that gets into the radiuses of the corners, the how it feels in your hand, all this stuff. And I think that the companies that have done really well have paid a lot of attention to those things. And I think a lot of times, when people don't pay attention to those things, they pay a price, because people make that subconscious decision. There's nowhere to get to it. That's like in the BIOS. Like, you can't get to that decision and change it, because they don't even see it. They don't see that they've made that decision. And I think that this kind of, there's so many things that Apple does that are in that little world that are subconscious things people make decisions about.
Things that seem trivial now and may have even seemed trivial then that are still really important. I mean, you're absolutely right, Alex. There's a subconscious level going on here. And to, again, beloved, hallowed, venerated classic Mac OS. But here's the thing about classic Mac OS. It was a black and white operating system designed in the early 80s. And although, System 7 and 8 had color and graphite interface and all these things, the bottom line was it was a black and white interface. And that color was sort of like stuck onto it to say, we got color. But even then, like, sure, you could have a colorful backdrop, but like, everything was still really monochrome with little tiny highlights. And so one of the messages he's sending with Aqua and the lickable interface and taking the graphics and maximizing them and minimizing them and doing all these things, he's showing you cool special effects that you could probably just wave your hands at it and say it's just sort of trendy graphic junk and it's meaningless and it's just empty calories. But it serves the larger purpose of, like, the Mac being the weak sister of computer operating systems in terms of graphics, ironically, as a graphics powerhouse and Photoshop and all that, but the OS itself being kind of this pale thing from the early 80s. That's Steve making it very clear that the era of the Mac being a kind of colorless computer is gone because of the graphics power that this thing had. Now, ironically, all that graphics overhead meant that it was super slow until 0.1 or 0.2.
Yeah.
They got there, like the hardware advanced and the software got tuned, but he was sending that message right up front that, like, this was not the old Mac interface with its kind of black and white things everywhere. This was just, everything. Even the buttons were animated, rendered, blue, glossy, lickable things, right? Like that was it was on one level, yes, sort of silly. On another level, super important to send that message.
Hey, it's Leo Laporte. If you enjoyed this little snippet of our programming, make sure you check out the full MacBreak Weekly. The link is right down there.